Hi guys, welcome to this week 2 lecture, Ecology Part 1. We're going to talk about the different levels of life, the types of population growth. We're going to talk about R and K selected species, biological control, which gets real fun, and species competition. So remember how we talked about abiotic factors being factors that are non-living in the environment. So pH, temperature, sunlight, salinity, all of those things are not living. And so we call those abiotic, A meaning without, biotic meaning life. And so now we're going to switch over to biotic factors. And so biotic factors are the living components of the organisms in the environment. So basically, all of the living organisms in the environment are going to be biotic factors. This includes fungi and bacteria, animals, plants. A lot of times we like to associate living things with animals and plants, and the fungi and bacteria we just kind of forget about sometimes. Or they're not as well publicized, I think. A lot of people think more about plants and animals than they do bacteria and fungi, but those are also living parts of the environment as well. All right, so we're going to start with the largest level of life called the biosphere. And the biosphere is going to encompass all of the ecosystems on Earth. All of those biomes, which we're going to talk about in a few weeks, and all of the living organisms on Earth as well. So all abiotic and biotic factors and all those ecosystems on Earth make up the biosphere. We're going to talk about the ecosystem. This is going to be all the abiotic and biotic factors within an area, basically a community and all its abiotic factors. And here you can see trees. There will be animals, probably bacteria in that water, for sure. And you can also see sunlight, precipitation, pH as well in this ecosystem. Here's a community. So a community is going to be multiple populations interacting together in an area. So here you see trees. In the background, you see birds. You see animals. There are bacteria both on land and in the water there. There's also bacteria within and on these organisms. There's probably insects back there in the grasses. All of those different populations that are interacting together in this area are going to be called a community. When we talk about populations, a population is a group of organisms of the same species that interact together. So here you can see a population of Taylor Swift fans. They're all humans and are all interacting together in the same area. And then I want to talk about species and organisms. So a species is a group of individuals that can successfully interbreed. So to be able to be referred to as a species, it's a group of individuals that can successfully interbreed and produce offspring that are also fertile. So the offspring have to be able to reproduce as well. For example, humans cannot reproduce with horses, okay? There are many reproductive barriers there that cause that not to happen, but that separates us from horses as a species because we cannot successfully interbreed. Certain organisms, even though the Asian elephant and the African elephant are both elephants, due to reproductive barriers, especially geographical isolation, they're not going to be able to interbreed successfully and have offspring that can reproduce. So to be considered a species, they have to be a group of individuals that successfully interbreed and their offspring are fertile as well. And here we have an organism, which is Taylor Swift, and this is just an individual living being. The levels of life can keep going all the way down to the cells. So basically, within Taylor Swift, she has many organ systems. These organs are going to be made up of tissues. Tissues are made up of cells, and cells are the smallest unit of life. But for this class, we're going to mainly focus on species, populations, communities, ecosystems, and the biosphere. So now let's talk about types of growth. So the first type of growth here is exponential growth. As you can see, this is a J-shaped curve. So the curve here has this nice J shape. And that's because there's no limiting factors affecting the growth. So basically, a population here would be able to continue to grow without anything limiting it, like resources such as food, shelter. Also, there's other factors that are not limiting it, like predation, for example. So maybe this is a population of organisms that do not have a direct predator, or they live in an area where there are no predators, and so therefore they're able to continue to reproduce without any limiting factors there. This is also known as R growth, and remember that when we talk about R and K selected species in just a minute. And basically in exponential growth, the number in the population is able to increase quite quickly. So you see how at the beginning you can start with a relatively low number in the population, but then over time it can drastically shoot up. So this is referred to as exponential growth. We have logistic growth. Logistic growth follows this S-shaped curve. And in logistic growth, the growth is limited by the carrying capacity. And that's this dotted line that you see here, where basically the growth has leveled out due to this carrying capacity. The carrying capacity equals K, so we write that as K. Remember that when we talk about R and K selected species. Or basically the carrying capacity is the number of organisms that can be supported by the habitat and environment. This is basically a limit of sustainability within the environment. And so we've reached the max here number of organisms that the environment can actually sustain. And once we reach this carrying capacity, the growth rate will decrease. And if you overshoot the carrying capacity, it usually leads to increased death rates. And this is because there are limiting factors such as predation. Maybe you have run out of food. Maybe you've run out of shelter. Maybe there is a hurricane or a tsunami or some sort of natural disaster that has caused the population to level off. Or some sort of limiting factor there. If you watched the video on exponential versus logistic growth, it's really good. So basically you start off with this population of bunnies and they're reproducing. There's no limiting factors. Everything's going good. You have lots of baby bunnies. And then all of a sudden a predator comes in and starts taking some out. There's like a storm and it wipes some out of the population. And then this is obviously fictional, but there's UFOs that come in and take out the bunnies. And so, and I think there's like a little hawk or something that flies in and grabs them. And so you can see how that population does not get to continue to grow exponentially. Instead, it's experiencing logistic growth when you limit the growth based on that carrying capacity and have those limiting factors. Okay, so talking about these limits to population growth, meeting that carrying capacity, we have two different types of limits to population growth. So the first one we'll talk about is density dependent. And basically what this means is that the size of the population really affects the growth rate and the limits to how much the population can continue to grow. And an example of that would be if your population gets so large, it's going to increase the risk for disease and parasites. The larger the population, the more individuals are going to interact with each other, spreading disease. An example of this actually is how we are urbanizing. And so all of these humans are moving to these urbanized areas because that's where the jobs are, right? And so a lot of people are moving into the city. We have less and less people living in rural areas. And this high density in these urbanized areas mean that organisms, or humans here in this case, are going to be able to interact with each other very often. And spread basically diseases. You probably are, if you haven't already experienced it this winter, you may know somebody who is experiencing the flu right now. And honestly, it's because people are in such close proximity to each other, and we just have such high population numbers that everyone interacting together is causing this increased risk for disease, or increased risk that you pick up the flu or some other type of virus. And then also, if we are in a very large group, predators are going to be attracted to that large population. So the more organisms there are in an area, the more predators are like, ooh, look at all these organisms over here. I'm going to go after this population. So these are density dependent factors. Density independent factors are limiting factors that are the result of nature. So for example, those tsunamis, those hurricanes, wildfires, for example, taking out a population. It doesn't matter the size of the population. It's going to be affected no matter what. So here you can see wildfires. We've had a lot of issues with wildfires, not only in Tennessee in the last couple of years, but out in California more recently. And basically, it doesn't matter if the population has, 500,000 individuals or it has 500 individuals. A wildfire can destroy and take out those populations with the same probability, basically. That it doesn't matter the size of the population, they both are going to be affected. Okay, so here we're going to talk about the difference in R and K selected species. So an R selected species is going to have a high reproductive rate and growth. So they're basically going to follow that exponential growth model. However, they can reach their carrying capacity, and in that point, they would become a logistic growth model. But these R-selected species usually have a short life. They grow very quickly. They have early maturity so that they can reproduce very quickly. They have lots of offspring, so a large clutch size, for example. And they have little parental care and protection or investment really in individual offspring. They kind of, here's my eggs, fertilize them, and leave them there. They are adapted to unstable environments, and basically they're pioneers or colonizers, and they're usually the first organisms to show up in an area. Then you have K-selected species. These organisms have a longer life, they're slower growing, They don't mature until much later. And then when they do mature and reproduce, they have just a few offspring. They're usually larger. They do take care of those organisms. So they have a lot of parental care or protection, and they have a lot of investment in their offspring. And these organisms are adapted to a more stable environment. And basically, case-selected species, because they don't have a lot of organisms, their goal is not to just, here, I'll have 100 offspring and hopefully, and just leave them here, and hopefully 50% will at least survive. Their goal here as a case-selected species is to have just a few offspring and then take really good care of those offspring that they have so that they reach adulthood. And this organism over here to the right is a spiny dogfish. And in my Bio 110 class, we actually dissect these in lab. But it's quite sad, actually, because the dogfish sharks, they don't mature until they are 35 years old. Yes, so this guy would not be able to reproduce until they are 35. And then once they do reproduce, they only have about 2 to 11 pups. The numbers really vary there. But that, once again, that's not a lot of offspring. These guys have a really late maturity, 35 years before they can even reproduce. And then they have the longest gestation period of any vertebrate. So it takes 18 to 24 months once the eggs are fertilized for the organism for offspring to be conceived, which is just kind of crazy. Almost 2 years. Can you imagine if we carried around children for 2 years? Yeah, I know. It'd be tough. I don't have children, so I've never done it for 9 months, but I can't imagine being pregnant for 2 years. But this is a really good example of a case-selected species here. What else do I want to say about these guys? Oh, it's also really important that we look at the sustainability of a fishery, especially these dogfish are actually fished for their meat. They're used in like fish and chips, for example. And when they have such a late maturity, you really can't take organisms that are young, that haven't been able to reproduce yet, out of the population, because you're only lowering the population numbers. And so when you go back for the next fishing season, for example, there's not going to be as many because those organisms weren't able to reproduce. So it's really important that you don't take juveniles out of the population. But once again, it takes 35 years for this organism to actually be able to reproduce. And when it does, it only creates 2 to 11 offspring. Okay, so here are some examples for you of R and K selected species. So I want you to take a minute. I want you to look at these and figure out which ones are R selected and which ones are K selected. Okay, so the R selected species here on this slide would be the frogs over here. Aren't they cute, little cuddling over here with all their offspring? Frogs lay all these eggs, and then they grow up into tadpoles. They do this metamorphosis, but there's not parental care going on. They have lots of offspring, fast growth. And then over here you have the blowfly, which is also an R selected species. It has a high reproductive rate. This female blowfly actually will be able to lay 250 eggs. And if you're familiar with blowflies, you know that they actually lay their eggs on dead organisms. Particularly, they like to lay them in the wounds of dead organisms, and we can actually use blowflies in forensic entomology, which is pretty cool. We can estimate how long someone or something has been dead based on the larval stages of the blowfly, which is pretty cool because its reproduction happens so fast in a matter of days or depending on the temperature. And then we have the K-selected species. Over here you have the elephant, and down here you have an Arctic fox. Are they not just the cutest organisms you've ever seen? But they would also be considered a K-selected species. They don't have as many young, late sexual maturity, don't reproduce as often. All right, so hopefully you watched those videos on biological control and you saw how there are good examples of biological control, and then there are also examples where biological control can go wrong. Biological control is when we use an organism to reduce the population size of another organism. Usually it's a pest, the one we're trying to get rid of. And so in the video about the cane toads, you saw how they brought in cane toads to eat the beetles that were basically wiping out the crops in Australia. And unfortunately, the cane toads thrived because they didn't have any natural predators. And they actually didn't eat the beetles, so they had the same problem that was always there, except now they have a new problem, which is that these cane toads secrete this this poisonous substance, sticky substance on their back, and even the tadpoles actually of cane toads can be deadly to organisms. And so these guys are reproducing because they are an R species. They reproduce at such a high rate. I think each female can lay about 35,000 eggs. And when organisms like snakes try to eat these cane toads, they actually die. Some of them were found, dead, trying to eat with like the cane toad still in the mouth of the snake because they're so deadly. And so these cane toads are not only causing issues with by killing native species in Australia, but they're also a menace on the roads. These guys are actually really large, and so they're causing people to run off the roads and stuff when they hit them. It's a big issue. But basically that was an example of when we tried to use biological control and it did not work. Now in the UK, if you watch the parasitic wasp video, you could see how they were using these parasitic wasps to lower the number of aphids that feed on the veg in UK. So here, these parasitic wasps are actually laying their young inside the aphids. The aphids die. The parasitic wasp young, the offspring, tries to keep the aphid alive or its vital organs alive until the last minute, until it's ready to reproduce. And then from there, basically, they try to kill these aphids, or they're trying to get rid of these aphids by using this parasitic wasp as a method of biological control. And so far, it's working, but a lot of times with biological control, there's not enough research that's done ahead of time, and sometimes you just can't predict what organisms are going to do. You need to do a lot of research about what natural predators there are located there and whatnot. All right, and the last thing I really want to talk about is two different types of competition: interest-specific competition, which is competition among members of the same species. So intra means within the same species here. And so this is an example of a bowerbird. I thought this was an appropriate example because of all of the plastic that this organism is using to build itself a nest. And so with bowerbirds, what happens is the male tries to build the biggest, best nest possible, and the female gets to choose which nest she likes the best. And that's the one that that's the male that she ends up mating with. So basically, the bowerbird is a construction worker, and whoever constructs the biggest castle or nest, in this case, gets to reproduce with the female. So as you can see here, he's trying to make his nest very colorful and plastic filled with all the bottle caps and straws that us humans like to not recycle and leave around. And so, unfortunately, that's what he's using to build his big, beautiful nest with. So he's in competition with other male bowerbirds to build the best nest possible so he can mate with a female. And then you have interspecific competition, which is competition between members of different species. And here you can see different plant species. And if you look, you can see the sunlight coming through the canopy here of this forest. And you can see how a lot of these organisms have broader leaves to try to capture this light, because these organisms are doing photosynthesis. All these trees and plants and are trying to capture sunlight to do photosynthesis. And so here they're in competition with each other for the amount of sunlight, also the amount of water. And so what you don't see in this picture is that there are roots under the ground, and these root systems are in competition with each other to try to pick up as much groundwater as possible and supply that tree or shrub plant with water. And so here all these different species are competing with each other for resources, which is interspecific competition. Thanks, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. And I'll see you next week for more ecology. I love ecology.